Okay, cool. I'm David Good. This is the International Friend Connection. I'm trying to decide what to do with these talks. Maybe I should call it the YouTube thing, Friends of David Good or something, because Anshar's my new friend, very remarkable dude. Um, he started out diagnosed on the spectrum, being 75% nonverbal. Was that right, Anshar?
Yeah, at age
And
11.
so 75% nonverbal at age 11. And then he's been able to overcome that. And he is a world class speaker. He trains big corporations in psychology and neuroscience. He's an autodidact, taught himself psychology and neuroscience, managed teams of PhDs. And he did this all on his own. It's just his own will overcoming those problems. And I want to talk to Anshar from the perspective of a young person that's struggling with that's on the spectrum struggling and who's also nonverbal like he was. For the next 30 minutes, we kind of want to go over what are some of the first steps you took to overcome that nonverbal. What kind of help being nonverbal, what kind of help did you get? And I guess we can go over the first steps and then maybe go on to the intermediate steps if we have time.
How about good friends,
There we
meaningful
go.
conversations?
Hey, good friends and meaningful conversations. Great idea.
You can
So
put good in quotes.
I'm gonna let you start an info dump now, and then so being on the spectrum, sometimes it's hard to know when to talk and when to interrupt and not interrupt. So if I interrupt you, I'm not being rude, and we may just need to summarize something or clarify a point for the audience. So feel free to go ahead and start.
Yeah, one of the things that's helped me a lot with that is I'll ask someone how long of an answer they want. Do you want the short version? Do you want the medium version, or do you want the long version?
Yeah,
And I've learned to identify that not everyone always wants the long version, and
that's
sometimes
true. I'm
the
learning that
question's
also.
rhetorical. So I have kind of an interesting journey. I grew up with two music teachers, so I had like 40 families a week in the house with me. And you would have thought that I would have socialized fairly well with all those kids around, but all I ever wanted to do was get away from the noise, and that was one of the early signs that I had some pretty bad sensory issues. And there's a lot of different reasons that someone on the spectrum can be either mostly or fully nonverbal. As much as like 30% of people on the spectrum can experience that either at one stage or even pervasively. So it is important to identify that there are lots of different reasons for that, just like a fever it can be a symptom of a lot of different things. But for me, it was a combination of sensory overprocessing, inability to socially connect, and then there was a lot of issues that I had early on being able to control the tone of my voice. I had almost no facial expressions. Most of the time, my gaze was downcast at the ground. I found that I wasn't able to look at people and talk to them at the same time. Um, it didn't really manifest itself in me like being shy and hiding behind my mother's skirts or anything like that. More like it was just hiding in general. The times that I would go out with my mother shopping or stuff like that, she would turn around and I would be gone. I would be hiding in a corner somewhere. I like to get myself into tight spaces so I could feel more secure. A lot of really bad bullying and stuff growing up because it was different. I didn't
Yeah, me
understand
too.
what social relationships were supposed to look like. So I think I remember I was in like third grade and I got into trouble at the school because I was running around trying to chase after the other kids on the playground trying to kiss them because I didn't understand intimacy or friendships or any of that. It was very confusing for me. Um, it was really, really challenging. And by the time that I had gotten through high school, um, like many people that I had learned more or less to mask. It was very exhausting for me to be in school. I didn't really have any friends. I would do that thing where I would sit in, the teacher's room and eat my lunch there and not go out for recess, that sort of thing, because I had to recharge just from the stress of, trying to function in the classroom environment. And yeah, it was just a ton of challenges. And this is in a time back before, because they'd only come up with a diagnosis of Asperger's, which I'm sure, as you know, has been, reincorporated the DSM to the spectrum and all the rest of that. That diagnosis didn't even exist until 2 years before I
Yeah.
graduated high school.
Now
So
what I say I am is I say I have the condition formerly known as Asperger's because they didn't really replace it with anything.
you just need a
Maybe
symbol
level
like
one
Prince.
autism. Yeah, so that's what I said. I suggested what should I what I wrote in an autism forum. What do we call it now? a lot of people said, well, I'm still going to call it Asperger's because they haven't made a new term. And one guy said, we'll call it the condition formerly known as Asperger's. And I'm like, that's awesome because Prince is the greatest. Sorry for
Well,
interrupting. Please continue.
the um the language issue can be difficult because as you're
Yeah.
moving into different cultural epochs and you have that whole hegemonic counter hegemonic thing of having these cultural ideas that we identify with, it can be very difficult to let go of language, especially if it's
Yeah.
allowed us to be able to self-identify or to find social unity. Um, we'll create a feeling of safety with those words, and then later on, if those words become inappropriate, we have a desire and inability to let go of them. In the modern neurodivergent community, I believe the kind of terminology that they're trying to aim for is just talking about someone's support needs. Do they have higher support needs or do they have lower support needs? And that's something that can change over time.
Yeah. That's true.
Maybe I could have been characterized as needing some higher support needs when I was younger, and then obviously, getting some facility with language and social interaction later, that could have changed. I think the thing that's important with some of those changes is that some of those terms, whether or not we think of them that way, can actually add some ableist language a little
Yeah.
bit. Because when you describe someone as, let's say, like low functioning and a high functioning, for example, because we can leave the whole Asperger's thing on a separate table just because that has a negative cultural association
Yeah.
from something that happened in history. But just something as simple as talking about high functioning or low functioning, that can be a fairly ableist set of terms, and it definitely doesn't give the impression that a person has the ability to move, from one way of being able to identify to another, that there might
Yeah.
be a social process there. I mean, when I was 19, I'd never been on a date, didn't have any friends, nothing outside of, sharing a social activity with like a mutual activity. Um, couldn't look at people, no facial expressions. I actually have a video of me from my mid 20s when I was in the middle of working on everything. I put it side by side, see a before and after. And
And to interrupt, what age? So, what age did you start working on yourself to overcome the nonverbal? Uh,
well, I mean, obviously, once I was in that isolation chamber early on, there was an intense desire to like build friendships and all of
yeah.
that. Especially once I moved into, about 14 years old, 13 years old, with a lot of social frustration along with it because I had so much difficulty. Um, so there was definitely a desire to work on it. The problem was is that there was no direction.
Yeah.
Um, like many neurodivergent people, I spent a lot of my early efforts on learning how to mask, and
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
ended
Me
up
too.
being destructive in ways that I never could have possibly anticipated. I mean, there's certainly an upside to putting on your anthropologist pith helmet and going and trying to hang out with the neurotypical people and learn how they do things and all of that.
Yeah.
But the downside is, and this is some of the things, one of the things that can be really frustrating when you're neurodivergent is you can sometimes be your symptoms are taken as character traits. So,
Yeah.
if I have a tendency to have a one-sided conversation or to info dump, or maybe I don't understand how emotional reciprocity and empathy is supposed to work. So someone shares, something emotional. I might share something emotional about myself to reciprocate because I'm trying to validate that
Yeah.
they're doing that, but it just comes across as me trying to change the subject to myself.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
I've encountered
so
that also. And I got coaching from Bob Berg and his community and when to do that and when not to, and how to ask permission to do that. If
yeah,
someone like in a business situation is different from a personal situation. And so it's very complex. It's interesting. So like software development seems rather simple compared to like having a conversation with a neurotypical person almost.
it just depends. It's about related skill sets, but also the intimidation, because there is a kind of emotional hypervigilance that you develop when you're masking, because you know when you see strange reactions in the room, when
Yeah.
you see two people whispering to one another in the corner, when you're first learning those skills, it could be you. Maybe you said
Oh
something
yeah.
inappropriate.
Yeah.
Maybe you did something inappropriate. So much like a person who has like an anxious avoidant parenting attachment style because they had like an abusive or an alcoholic parent or something like that, and they could give mom the same information 2 days in a row and have two completely different responses.
Yeah.
There's that sense of kind of squinting and seeing, is she in a good mood, is she in a bad mood? There's that same kind of emotional hypervigilance that goes on with the people that are around you because you're trying to see if you can keep your finger on the pulse of it
Yeah,
as if you've done
that's
something
true.
wrong. So there's an inherent anxiety that goes along with that process, but also the reward for being nearly perfect at masking is that when you make a mistake, you're punished in the worst possible way
Yeah,
because you haven't established any context for them to be able to take your behavior as anything but communication. So, you know, that's one problem in that by not self-advocating and trying to, blend in, that you're going to be very negatively socially judged for that mistake because you've given no context for it. And then the last part of it is that you end up getting um, almost a kind of imposter syndrome. If you make these social connections by pretending to be something that you're not, then you will always end up having that fear that if people knew the way that you quote unquote really are, that they wouldn't be interested in being your friend. And so
yeah.
um, there's an inherent problem with self-esteem there as well. So that whole process of getting better and better at masking and putting more and more effort into that as an initial stage just ended up teaching me that it was actually the wrong thing to do. But I guess I had to take that all the way to its conclusion to realize that.
Yeah, when like a lot of times when I was younger, there was no diagnosis, there was no help. You're kind of on your own. I was just a weird kid. So you were kind of a teenager when you started learning to overcome being nonverbal.
But
Um,
I didn't know that that's what it was because
yeah.
I didn't
Ah, okay.
actually get the diagnosis until I tried to join the military.
Ah,
So
okay.
so for me,
Yeah, I saw you were in the Navy for a year, and that was pretty impressive.
yeah.
You did cryptography.
Yeah, I was kind of set on this idea that I needed to get out of my comfort zone and get out of my shell, and that if I joined the military, that I would have some sense of structure. I would know how to address people. There was a certain safety in
Yeah,
that. Plus, it was an opportunity for me to develop some independence, um, and it was through that process. I'd already gone through boot camp and all of that stuff, and started to move up into my A school program, and I was having some of the same social difficulties that I did when I was younger. And at that point, and I'm here in the United States, so we have kind of that whole capitalistic medical care thing. But when you're in the military, healthcare is free. And so I just said to myself, well, I've been having these issues a long time.
yeah.
Maybe there's something I can take. Maybe I should just, go let them know what's going on. And so I did, and they just kept on referring me upward and referring me upward. And then, at a certain point, I was basically sitting in front of five doctors, and they were explaining to me the different possibilities and that I was likely on the spectrum, and I had no idea what that meant. And it was at that point I had to decide, do I stay in? What do I do? And I almost stayed in. And then I had a friend of mine, that I'd gone all the way through boot camp and all of that with, and he asked me a really poignant question, which was, this bunch of new information, you're dealing with all of that. What if one of these symptoms, the task transitions or inability to determine context or sarcasm or whatever, what if you ends up making you make a mistake and you end up hurting somebody? How are you going to feel about that? And I realized that there was so much that I had to learn about, living with autism, that it would have been very inauthentic for me to continue, even though there were so many things in that military career that I wanted. And so I took them up on their offer and just got a general medical condition discharge or whatever, and kind of went on with everything else after that. But my journey of actually knowing that it was autism and working in that direction didn't really start until I was about 20 years old. So that's how delayed that was.
Okay, awesome. So you were in the military, then you left the military. Is that when you started getting the right helper training? And what helper training was that you got to overcome being nonverbal?
Well, I had had a lot of issues with vocal control and tone, and
Okay.
my mother was a voice teacher, so I started doing all the vocal exercises that she was doing around the house. But I also started taking a lot of pictures and video of myself, because I was having a lot of trouble figuring out what facial expressions should look like, what micro expressions should look like, how to smile in a way that actually seemed genuine and didn't come across
Yeah.
as creepy. And so I have folders and folders with just thousands of pictures of all these different expressions, trying to figure out what I should be doing with my face. Um, it was really it was a self-taught process. I would model sometimes the behavior off of something. If I I saw a celebrity laugh a certain way, and I thought that, that seems like that's getting a really good reaction. Maybe I should try learning how to laugh that way. It was kind of like trying on a bunch of different things and trying to figure out a way to be able to transmit my personality. It wasn't that I was inventing a personality. It was just there was no way to, shout loud enough to get over the brick wall and actually have someone hear it. So I had to
Yeah,
figure that part out. But then there was also understanding all of the social rituals and reciprocity and sarcasm and um, how to build rapport with people. And some of that I got exposed to tangentially, in some of my first sales positions, because I was in information technology for like 15, 16
yeah.
years. And
And
I
that's
just
kind of a
assumed,
safe place for people like us when you
yeah,
don't have to interact with people that much.
I thought I would be
Um,
doing it for the rest of my
our
life, is
brains are
what I thought.
great for information. Like I thought I was going to do IT and programming the rest of my life, but then injury from a car accident, it got exacerbated. No longer could be a computer programmer. Got a medical
Mhm.
treatment, took away my ability to be a computer programmer also. So had to kind of reinvent myself and pivot again and rebuild my life back from scratch.
Yeah, I think as that process continued organically, and I had a lot of failures with it.
Yeah,
I kind of asked myself an interesting question because up until that point in my life, I'd had maybe 50, 60 autistic special interests. And, I would just deep dive into something and
yeah,
disappear into it sometimes for months. And I asked myself kind of a cool question. What if I could find a way to get fascinated about the brain and the way that the mind works in the same way that I had done so many other things? If I could find that fascination, maybe that process would teach me something. And that's pretty much what I did is I turned that searchlight onto the brain. And what I found there blew me away, totally changed the whole direction of what I had been doing up until that point. So much so that about 5 years after that, I had gotten very accustomed to putting myself into challenging situations, realizing that the only way I was going to grow was to put myself into those situations and how to, change my patterns of behavior. What did success look like? Making good goals for myself. And by the time that I hit 30, um, I went up to Oregon. I was going to do more information technology stuff up there, and I didn't realize that the job market was so competitive. There's like 6 universities there, and as a result, for the first time in a long time, I found myself unemployed, and I had money saved up and all of that. I was, sitting there knocking on doors, and one day I walked past a jewelry store, and walking past that jewelry store, and I saw the help wanted sign, and I thought to myself, here is a product that has only a social and emotional value.
yeah,
That building a relationship is not just about understanding the emotional state of the customer and making them comfortable, but sometimes, like a couple will come in and they'll have completely different emotional concerns. And that whole narrative is all completely, social and emotional. And then on top of that, up until that point in my life, I'd had a fairly, and I think a lot of people on the spectrum might be able to identify with this, but I was very intimidated by the opposite sex. That
yeah,
was a problem for me. And here's an industry that's like 95% dominated by women. So almost all women working in the store, you've got a completely emotional social product. You've got uh, basically a necessity to even be able to enter into a sales conversation requires understanding their emotional journey because you're helping them tell their story. And I thought to myself, that sounds impossible. Let's do it.
yeah.
So basically,
So
if I
actually,
was
if I can
able,
interrupt real quick.
Mhm.
So one of the first steps you took was to kind of you took all those photos, tried the different expressions, started studying up, and then you made yourself grow by jumping into a sales position. And
Every time I
then
put myself somewhere uncomfortable, I found
yeah.
that I was growing.
So the key to overcoming anything is what I said on a lot of podcasts. It's being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And like I learned how to do that through reaching out and learning acceptance and commitment therapy. That was the thing that taught me how to be in pain, but go do it anyways. Have depression, go do it anyways. Have anxiety, but go do it anyways. And I went from having a needle phobia to being able, no problem, get 16 shots in my head. So you jumped right into the sales job. And then you saw that jewelry store job and you said that would be an even bigger challenge. So let's take that on and let's see what we can do. And that helped you transform. So please
Well,
continue.
it's all mindset. If
Yeah.
you get into a situation like that and you're waking up at 6 in the morning or whatever, getting ready for work, and you're dreading it all day, then that's the mindset you're going to be in when you go there. But that's not where I was at. I would wake up and I'd think, okay, who am I working with today? What can I learn from them? What are they good at? What am I weakest at? Take a personal inventory. What's something I can work on today? And I knew that putting myself into an environment where I was working, 50 hours a week doing that was going to help me get over some of that fear, some of it due to exposure, but also get rid of some of that anxiety of not knowing what to do. And by the time that I had finished working with that company over the course of about 7 years, because this is K and K Jewelers and Jared the Gallery of Jewelry. They're the largest retail jewelry store in the United States. I went from being a part-time sales associate, and after like 7 years, I was teaching the entire Pacific Northwest,
Wow.
emotional, psychosocial dynamics, and emotional journey with the customer, the whole nine. And so I went from literally being a part-timer to teaching all of the managers in our district. And that was so rewarding. And even though I haven't done that work now for about what, 8 years, 6 years, something like that. All those people that I trained are all off, managing their own stores and stuff like that. And there's certainly a
And
sense of,
it's a testament to you making yourself uncomfortable and overcoming your limitations. And then it's a testament to you building your leadership skills that those people are all successful now.
yeah, I think it's more about not being afraid of your limitations, because
Yeah.
the only way that you'll understand your limitations is to be willing to step up to that Kierkegaardian cliff and actually look over the edge of it. And without that, you have that fear of even approaching that place. And I had to
Yeah.
shed myself of that fear. So,
Yeah. You have to
um,
learn to overcome the fear.
after I did that, um, I went on to start teaching and creating sales systems for other things, teaching people how to connect, customer retention, psychosocial dynamics, neuromarketing, applied behavioral psychology, public relations, all of that. And I never in a million years would have expected that the thing that I found most challenging would be the thing that I teach other people for a living, but that's what I do now. And
And this is kind of your purpose, your mission, and you find it more rewarding than being an IT.
A lot more rewarding, because when you help people be better at what they're passionate about and what they do, you start to connect with them in a really unique way, because you have to really, on an integral level, understand what it is that a person is trying to accomplish and why. You have to understand their why if you want to start, pulling things apart and being able to give them advice and starting to examine their processes and whatnot. And you need to be able to translate any feedback that you have to that language for them, so that they can understand how it helps serve that purpose that they're chasing. Because people will have
Yeah.
their own objections, their own cognitive modeling that can stand in their way. And having an understanding of what's driving them in the first place, that's going to be necessary in order to be able to get them over some of those road bumps where, maybe a belief system or their own personal objection that they didn't know that they had, or maybe even a set process that they've attached themselves to that isn't actually accomplishing what they want it to. People can get their fingers into those things and feel a sense of loss
Yeah.
otherwise. And being able to understand that, and understand that I had to make them feel as if I understood how they showed their work and got to the place that they're at, and validate that first before I was able to give them more information. Otherwise, it just felt like I was coming out of nowhere and trying to pull things apart. And I think it also gave me an interesting perspective once I started doing advocacy for the neurodivergent and for neurodiversity, um, getting a sense of what it's like for non-neurodivergent people to work with us.
Yeah.
And I think that we get on the negative end of that so much, and there are so many frustrations for us in the workplace and in organizations and whatnot, that it can be very difficult for us to remember you know, the kinds of emotions and cognitive experiences that we're giving to people on the other end by being a iconoclast, by not having inherent respect for, authority or ideas, or um, being focused on, deconstructing things or
Yeah.
giving, unbiased feedback. And a lot of people can be sensitive to those processes. I didn't recognize what it must have felt like, in college when I was ruining the curve for everyone else, or,
Yeah.
you know, when I, got super interested in the topic that the professor was talking about. And so I wrote a paper that was 5 pages longer than everyone else's. It never occurred to me that that would even affect them, but it did.
Yeah.
And being able to acknowledge that, I think, gave
So
me
it sounds like
a.
you're able to learn a lot of empathy for neurotypical people.
I'm of the opinion that empathy looks different for us, just
Yeah.
because I think that um, the neurological process of empathy, and there's some contention in the neuroscience community over things like mirror neurons and whatever. So we can get off of the
Yeah.
specificity of that and maybe just talk about um, results-driven observations. But there is a there's an issue with peer reciprocity and the understanding of emotions, and even if you've had exactly the same experience as another person, that doesn't mean that you've emotionally processed that experience the same way.
That's
You
true.
know, one person could grow up with a father in jail or whatever and use that as an excuse in their life to, go and rob banks or whatever. And the next guy over might use that as a model for how he doesn't want to raise his kids.
Yeah.
And their emotional reaction and their processing is different. So I think what I've learned is that empathy is the biological shortcut for real listening and communication, because empathy gives the other person the ability to recognize that you are able to feel a ghost of that same emotion that they're experiencing. That's the normal automatic process that happens. But if you can be such a good listener that you truly understand how they went through that process and how they got there and what it meant to them, that can sometimes be a deeper level of empathy
Yeah.
than that which you can get from an automatic process in the brain.
Yeah, that's true. And one question I'll ask, we'll just go for a few more minutes and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So were there any specific books or training that you got along the way that helped, or was this all trial and error in your own brain kind of analyzing things as you went?
Well, I mean, there was a book that really sparked my interest. It was what made me ask the question, what would happen if I made the brain and psychology into an autistic special interest? And that book for me was The Dragons of Eden by Carl Sagan.
Okay.
And in that book, he talks about the disparate evolutionary processes that exist and must have existed in order for human consciousness to come about. And understanding that there were a bunch of processes that have been biased by the process of evolution from mammalian evolution in the way that the brain is developed, and that can really affect us negatively with modern technology and modern human society. That it affects the way that we process our own lives and our own narrative and our belief systems. And it's everything from small sample size to negative, negative memory bias and primacy.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that a lot of people may not consider is that the brain is evolutionarily primed to remember negativity, stress.
Yeah,
As
that's
our
true.
as
Our
our
brains are evolutionary primed to think negative and remember negative stuff more.
well,
Um,
it's just if a lion chases you up a tree, the brain needs to remember that. So when you
yeah,
have these
that's
periods
true.
of heightened stress, adrenaline, cortisol, the hippocampus just lights up, and it's like, oh my God, this is terrible. Keep rolling. And we'll have those experiences where we have something incredibly negative happen, and we almost see it in slow motion. It's almost like the frames per second have gone up. And because there's so much more primacy, and psychologists disagree, it can be anywhere from 5 to 50 times the primacy. But just even if it was five,
Yeah,
the idea that when you have a negative experience, that you spend 5 times as much time processing that negative experience as you do a positive experience, it creates a very warped funhouse mirror of the narrative of your life, because
yeah, that's
you
true.
will remember with painstaking clarity all of your negative experiences, your failures, that terrible breakup, that time that you were,
Yeah,
starving or poor, and then our positive accomplishments are lost over time. And being able to counteract that effect is something that has to be um, done on purpose. because if you
Yeah.
don't do that, you lose the ability to remember your positive
And I think that
accomplishments.
gives me inspiration for the first question for our Q&A. But before we start the Q&A, um, I wanted you to just go over the Octopus Movement real quick for a minute, tell people what it
Sure.
is and what the main goal you want to accomplish is.
So the Octopus Movement was founded by Dr. Perry Nopper in the Netherlands, and his dream was to have a mycelium of nonlinear thinkers who would be able to come up with answers for the world's problems in a different way. And what that was going to look like, he wasn't sure, but that was the dream. And from that point, starting forward, I think we're in. I'd have to take a look at the list again, but I think we're in like 40 countries now.
Wow.
And the whole idea, and it's not, obviously in a place where nonlinear thinking is valued, you do tend to get a decent percentage of people there who are neurodivergent. But you don't need to be neurodivergent to be a nonlinear thinker. The idea is that you don't use conventional methods to solve problems, or rather that a lot of the time you don't think of the conventional method first. You think of the non-conventional method of solving problems first. And to have these people, especially, these multi-potentialites who have gone and dabbled in like 10 different careers, because I don't think a lot of people think about it, but if you were, oh, I don't know, let's say you were a potter, and then you were a plumber, and then maybe you got into biomedical engineering, and then after that you became a brain surgeon, and then after that you became an epidemiologist. When you're looking at I don't know, like let's say a brain organism, a parasite that's using the circulatory system to travel from point A to point B, your perspective at solving that problem might be completely alien and
Yeah.
different from a person who just studies one of those disciplines.
Yeah, it's having
And
having that diverse perspective of experience.
so the whole goal is to just have an appreciation, not just for that, but also how nonlinear thinking can sometimes rub people the wrong way, and
Yeah.
it can create a resistance to some of those ideas because a lot of modern organizations are hell bent at trying to create this order and sense of purpose and try to get everyone moving in the same direction. And so sometimes those outliers who are capable of that nonlinear thinking, they end up striking people the wrong way because they end up going against the grain. And that can be really difficult. I mean, and looking at it from the other perspective, you have an organization, you're trying to get everyone moving in the same direction, and here's this person who's trying to reinvent the wheel all the time. um, I think we just have to look to Socrates, just asking the question, what
Yeah.
is and why, how unpopular that can be. So I think that belonging to that group and getting to participate in the think tanks and eventually getting to become a founding member, that's been a real honor for me,
Yeah.
and
Sounds like a
getting to see how that's,
fascinating
yeah.
organization. What I'd like to do, kind of open it up to the Q&A. And actually, the first question I got inspired to ask, because you talked about how our brains tend to, are biologically wired to kind of think negative. What are some things that you have used to overcome your own negative thoughts about yourself? Because, like, I've always struggled with a lot of negative thinking about myself. And right now, I'm working with a therapist doing internal family systems, and I'm finding that very helpful in overcoming that negative self perfection perception. A lot of those negative thoughts I think about myself.
Well, I mean, there is a kind of a holistic model of psychology, and there's a lot of different aspects to that question. I kind of have to do that. Do you want the short version, medium
Yeah,
version,
let's
long
do a
version?
short version, and then maybe we can come back talk about that later.
But everything from the language that you find yourself using on a habitual basis that can change your perception. You have the parenting attachment style
Yeah.
from when you were growing up. So, how do you find emotional validation where your feelings of safety, emotional safety come from? Um, then you have the primacy of negative emotions. So, are you doing enough to celebrate your positive accomplishments and make
Okay.
milestones for yourself? When you achieve goals, do you take the time to be able to call those things out? Are you always making incremental steps towards your goals so that you have a sense of achievement and accomplishment? Are you starting your day off with small achievements and accomplishments to build momentum? Um, then there's cognitive modeling. Do you have negative cognitive belief systems? And if so, are you looking outside of your own perspective to be able to compare those cognitive models with truth? A lot of that process can't always be done on your own with that warped lens. So
Yeah.
sometimes inviting another person that you trust to be able to test those belief systems with you can be incredibly helpful.
Yeah. One
Are
one thing
you,
I've found is you got to
oh, there's more,
so.
there's more,
Oh,
there's
okay.
more.
We'll
Are you,
keep going.
are you surrounding yourself with people who are different versions of the person that you want to be so that you have
That's
a
exactly what I was gonna say, dude.
social uprising to success? Um, when you are making new goals for yourself and for the future, do you create realistic goals that actually are reflective of the line of advancement that you're looking for? Are you viewing yourself as your own manager, being able to recognize where the gaps are and what it is that you're trying to accomplish and what the actual reasons are for those gaps so that you can make a dedicated plan rather than just thinking of yourself in a negative way? There
Yeah.
is this really bizarre thing that happens culturally, anthropologically, where you and I might watch like a 6 or a 10 month old, stumbling around learning how to walk. And every time they fall over, we might laugh a little to ourselves, because we know what's at the end of that
Yeah.
journey. And we encourage that infant or that child or the toddler to do that. But there's this magical flip over that happens after that kind of liminal phase when we move into being adults, where failure has, instead of becoming something that's absolutely necessary for the process of success, that it's something to be, denigrated um, and that we have to feel shame over failure,
Yeah.
even though failure is absolutely necessary in order to
Yeah. Failure
succeed. So
failure is essential to getting where you want to go in life.
and so I think that being able to fight, some of those cultural perceptions, because I think that our fear of not being enough, especially socially, is something that is preyed upon in kind of the modern capitalistic, model, this
Yeah.
idea of, trying to sell products and stuff. You're not enough without this. You're going to fail if you don't do this, and then no one's going to like you. There's this whole social tier system that's built on that, and it's incredibly negative, but it also has nothing to do with truth.
Yeah. That's true. I'd like
That's
to
the
move
short version.
a short version. Cool. Well, someday I'd like to hear the long version, but I want to let some of our guests and ask some questions here. I'm going to give out your LinkedIn and your link app. So if anyone wants to use your services or hire you for business purposes, feel free to get in touch with our good friend Anshar. I also gave the International Friend Connection website if you care to support us with a donation, buy a t-shirt or mug. And I'd like to open the floor up for questions. I invited someone here tonight, and I hope that person's had the courage to come here tonight so that they can get the help they need. And so I'd like to open the floor up to questions. I know Nicole. Nicole's a good friend of mine. I'd like to let Nicole, would you like to ask the first question? If you had something to ask, otherwise we'll open it up to everybody else. Feel free to type your questions in chat. We had one question come up on chat. Let's see. They asked, Ansar, what is your view on the subject that neurodivergents have some form of superpower or enhanced ability as a result of their divergence?
Well, when it comes to neurodivergence, I mean, comorbidity is really high between the different modalities of neurodivergence. I mean, just an autism diagnosis, I mean, you've got between a 40 and 60% incidence of comorbidity with ADHD. You have people who have language impairment, social impairments, changes in brain function, changes in the size of the neuronal density of the amygdala. You've got people with nonverbal variants of autism, intensity of sensory processing disorder, the mix of ASD and ADHD, for example, can create sensory seeking autism. There's all of these different kinds of the neurodivergent tree because so many different systems of the brain are interconnected. And I think that what happens is there's a tendency for us to focus on maybe the one or two things that a neurodivergent person maybe does differently because of the way that they process or focus on their environment. And of course, there's movies like Rain Man and stuff like that,
Yeah,
who portray savants. Um, and it can be very easy to kind of look at neurodivergence as a superpower because one way or the other, whether the volume is turned down or turned up on something, it's going to give us different facility than other people might have. But I think autism in particular, there is an inability to stop the inflow of information. It's kind of like being forced to look at the whole world through a magnifying glass. And the intensity of that detail that you get can sometimes be used to be able to process things on a level that maybe other people from just chance exposure might not get to. But I think that that cultural perception has a tendency to override and cause us to ignore all of the people out there that have really intense needs for things to
Yeah.
change. Like, for example, just looking at myself, I mean, I didn't even get my driver's license until I was 37 years old because of my sensory processing issues. And lack of access to effective transportation is a gigantic problem for young autistic adults. I think the unemployment rate for us is over 80% under the age of 25. So there are a bunch of challenges. And while it can be good to attract attention with stuff like that, I can do a Rubik's Cube with my eyes closed, but whether or not that actually has anything to do with what the actual life of having a condition is like,
Yeah.
I think people like to cherry pick these little instances, and then use that to form a public perception. And it
Yeah.
doesn't
A lot of
give
people don't see the suffering that people like us go through.
Well, I mean, there was an intense amount of suffering. I mean, after I got that autism diagnosis and realized I actually had a developmental disability that was causing a lot of my social problems, it made me suicidal at first.
Yeah.
It's a lot of information.
Yeah. And
And
I'm
being
so
different,
sorry you had to go through that. I know how bad that hurts.
well, being different is painful.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it is.
and socially, there's another problem too, and that is that when you have an invisible disability, um, it's not like having one that's obvious to the eye. If you have
Yeah.
let's say you're in you have a friend who's in a wheelchair, your chances of getting angry at that person for not helping you move are not very high.
Yeah.
But you might get angry at your neurodivergent friend for forgetting your birthday or
Yeah. That's
for,
true.
not asking the right emotional follow-up questions when you share
Because the
something.
disability or the disadvantage isn't visible.
And that's very, very difficult. Having those symptoms taken as character traits
Yeah.
sets you at such a gigantic social disadvantage. And it's very crippling, especially for young people. So I would call attention to that whole idea of, autism or ADHD or whatever being a superpower. I think it just because we have the ability to focus on something, and maybe because of that focus, if that special interest happens to go over something that happens to be valued in society. Because I don't think that a lot of people are thinking of autism as a superpower when someone memorizes all the different kinds of brass works on bridges,
Yeah.
or every costume and comic book artist that Spider-Man's ever had.
Yeah.
But if it
I
happens to
I want
cross
to interrupt
over,
because we got a couple other questions to get to
Mhm.
before we end here. And again, we're just taking questions in chat. Let's see. Next question was how to handle a neurodivergent who tends to dominate the conversation, constantly interrupts during conversation. What's the best way to approach dealing with them without hurting them? And then we have one final question after that one.
Okay, well, in order for a person um, to be able to modify their own behavior, that requires one, self-awareness, and
Yeah.
two, a desire to change that behavior. So first, that person has to recognize that they're having difficulty with social reciprocity. And then second, that person has to have a desire to change that. And until those two things happen, it's no different than modifying any other social behavior that you might find obnoxious, except for the fact maybe that it's involuntary. Um, there are definitely different levels of awareness when it comes to a person who's on the spectrum. Maybe they have low support needs, and for them, it manifests as more of a personality affect. And it's very easy to sit down with them and have a conversation and be like, hey, I noticed this particular thing. Would you say that that's part of your traits as a neurodivergent person, or is this just because you're really passionate about this thing? Give them an opportunity to be able to explain the behavior. And
Yeah.
then maybe give them some social or emotional insight on how it ends up making everyone feel, and see whether or not they have a desire to change that behavior. And then, just like anything else, see if you can get buy-in from that person on, well, if that was something that we wanted to avoid more often in the future, is there something that you would like me to let you know or to do with you, so to be able to redirect that? Or, is there, see, because people are a lot more bought in on solutions if you have the ability to brainstorm with them as opposed to
Yeah.
telling them what to do. I would say that would be the first three parts there, because if
Okay.
if there's if there's lack of social recognition that is causing a problem, they don't realize that they're doing it in the first place, or they don't have the self-awareness to do that, then trying to jump to the step where you're trying to change their behavior seems a little ill-advised. I don't think that's going to give you the
Yeah, that's
results that
true.
you want.
Yeah. And one thing I've learned to do now that I'm more aware of being Asperger's, or the condition formerly known as Asperger's, um, one thing I've learned to do with friends is I tell my good friends, now I'm going to need your help because I want to get better at interpersonal communication and better relationships. So when I say, like, if I say something that makes you upset or uncomfortable, or if I have certain mannerisms, things like that, or if I talk too much about myself or something, I need your help in coaching myself or coaching me, because you giving me that feedback is only going to help me. And when I'm in a relationship with someone, I always like to do check-ins every once in a while. Did I do anything to upset you or anger you or anything like that, or is there anything I need to work on? I think,
Positive frameworks for that
yeah.
language are incredibly important for two
Oh yeah.
reasons. One, there's a gigantic difference between apologizing that something is quote unquote wrong with you
Yeah.
and thanking a person for their patience and for their understanding and positively sharing your
Okay.
challenges. So, but that change in language doesn't just affect the response of the other person, but it also changes your own mental modeling as to whether
Oh
or not you're
wow.
setting yourself up to believe that, you're a burden and all these things are negative.
Yeah.
And, you
Yeah,
know,
see, that's what I grew up believing, that I was kind of a burden and a lot of negatives. So I'm learning to change my own language. And this talk has been actually so helpful to me tonight. I'm very proud to know you.
well, there's a
And
problem too with ADHD. You can actually have physiological changes in the brain that cause rejection sensitive dysphoria, and
yeah,
make you a lot more inclined to feel negatively socially perceived, and that can add an extra level of weight to that entire thing. So,
yeah,
and many of us, especially getting a diagnosis at a later age, have that experience of friends or family members treating us as if our behavior is voluntary and
yeah,
that we're doing it because we're lazy or it's an excuse, or and
yeah,
I mean, you wouldn't point at a person in a wheelchair and be like, well, you can actually walk. That chair is just an excuse. You don't do that to someone. So it's interesting that when a disability is invisible, that people have a tendency,
yeah,
when we're making them negatively emotionally process, because that's what people don't want to talk about, is that if I'm neurodivergent and I forget your birthday because I'm hyper focused on something, or, God knows what, that you have a right to feel aggrieved. You have
yeah,
valid emotions. You have a valid emotional response. The difference is that it is not healthy to send those negative feelings at that person if that is
yeah,
not something that they're doing intentionally to you. You have every right to process that negativity, to be able to redirect it and to be able to own it. But you don't punish the person with a disability for something that's
yeah.
involuntary and
That's
then
very
add
true.
that to the social weight of already being in a normal interaction. And we all have those negative interactions with people that we've been around for so long, like our parents and whatnot, who will take things over a course of time for granted, as you will in any extended relationship, especially with family. And then they will start assigning labels to you. Oh, you're sloppy, or you're messy, or you're lazy, or you're this, or you're
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, well, thank you. And then for one final question, um, if you give any insight to this, how do you find a relationship in marriage when an autistic? Any tips?
Well, the first step, I think, is mapping out for yourself, what does that look like? What are you looking to get out of a relationship? And really you should start with a friendship. What things are most important to you, um, that you cannot live without when it comes to a friendship? And if a list of a certain length is good, just to make sure that you're examining ideas well enough, maybe make a list of 10, maybe 10 things
Yeah,
that you absolutely have to have out of a friend. Now, these aren't these aren't wants, these are needs,
yeah,
right? Wants, that's give and take, right? But what are 10 things that you absolutely have to have out of a friendship? And then what are 10 things that you absolutely have to have out of a romantic relationship for it to be meaningful and to give you what you want? And once you can figure out what that looks like, then you can ask yourself, okay, because one of the things that can happen when you have either like an anxious avoidant, attachment style with parents, or if you have neurodivergent imposter syndrome or whatever, is that once a person actually says that they like you, it's almost as if you're trapped, you're stuck, because that's so rare and you feel so unworthy of love or so unworthy
Yeah.
of want that it can be very difficult to say no to the wrong people or people who aren't able to meet your
Yeah.
needs. And so being able to recognize with a clear head um, what it is that you absolutely have to have in order to be able to have a healthy, functioning relationship, and then to have the courage to stand up for those things. I think that's an important first step just for your own direction and health, because a relationship should add to your life, not define it. That'd be the first
That's
thing.
true.
And then after that, it's going to come down to what flavor of autism you have. Because
Yeah.
just saying, an autistic this or an autistic that, autism looks incredibly different for so many different people. So it's going to be less about the fact that you're autistic and more about the fact that you're a unique person with unique challenges and unique needs. And you're going to have to be able to find someone who can interplay with those things in a way that's actually going to be positive and put you in the right place. And being able to understand that 10 relationships with the wrong people will hurt your life more than, being alone and
Yeah.
being
That's
willing to
very
say no
true.
to things that are
Yeah.
bad for you. That's very, very hard to do when you felt rejected or socially isolated or pushed away. So
Yeah.
I think establishing those boundaries first, it'll give you that certitude of what you're looking for, which I think is a good first step.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming tonight. Again, I'm going to put your links in the chat for people who want to contact add you on LinkedIn or hire your business. And again, just so grateful you came tonight. I learned a ton. I mean, we could sit here, me and you could talk all night long, but we got to respect people's time and everything. And thanks again for coming to the International Friend Connection, and hope everyone has a good night.